No, I sat down and I was like, "Hey, I know these people. What? I know you." So it is great to see you all virtually in person at 7-Eleven, or Hannah, who I saw in Fred Meyer yesterday. So my name is Mike Brown. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Senior Community Engagement Manager for Hilltop Children's Center Educator Institute here on the traditional lands of the Duwamish tribe, the first people of what is now known by colonizers as Seattle, Washington. I am grateful to be in community with you all and to be able to share this message of joy, of love, of an inner voice in hopes that it can uplift you and inspire you to do the amazing and great work that you are doing in your environments. I want to give honor and thanks to the indigenous people, the Duwamish tribe, whose we are currently gathering on right now, and encourage you all to learn more, to center, to decolonize your minds in order to indigenize everything that you're doing through the lens of the multiple lens and ways of being and living and learning and being joyful through an indigenized way. So, with that being said, we are going to throw it to Chelsea with just how are you entering the space today?
I think I'm pretty present. I do not have air conditioning, so yeah, it's a little hot, but it has been a good day, and I feel present, and learning stories are just one of my favorite things to talk about. So I really am in a good spot.
Perfect. So I wanted to know and start off this conversation today just wondering why. Why did you pick three stories aside from me telling you and pushing you into that?
Yeah.
Why three stories that you chose to share in your recording?
Why those three in particular, or why more
Absolutely.
than one?
Why
those three in particular? Well, those were all stories. I think maybe not so much on the Margot story, but those were all stories where my view of the child was impacted by that story. So, my view of their strengths, of their personalities, their what they were bringing, what they were dealing with, was positively impacted by writing those stories. And so, if my inner monologue, my inner narration about them was impacted, it put under the microscope how it could impact them. And so I wanted to share that idea.
So I'm curious to hear about how have your view of children grown over the years from writing these stories.
You get to see them as much more complex. It's so easy to dismiss for some people, and as you're starting out and before you really get to know the kids or get to know the field, it can be really easy to just not take it as seriously as you watch them chase after bubbles or get surprised by a butterfly or build up a tower with blocks. It's like, oh, that's just what kids do, yada yada whatevs. But when you're asked to really demonstrate what is the learning that's happening, and if you're going to do that from a child-centered and a play-centered perspective, for me, using learning stories gave it just so much more complexity and so much more depth and so much more meaning for what the learning was, as opposed to something like a checklist, or something where it's just sort of like, got it, move on. So I think for me now as an educator, because I've come at this approach using learning stories, I'm better able to slow down when I'm with kids and really try to observe them, and not put as much of my stuff, whether it's baggage or ideas or hopes or whatever it is, and I'm better able to slow down and respect the learning and the way that they're approaching it.
Well, do you think that it's possible to separate who you are as an individual, right? You as feminine, you femme-identifying, you as white, you as from Colorado, right?
Well,
How do
I'm from here. I just lived there a long time.
you,
I'm a Northwesterner.
how do you feel like you can separate those identities, or can you, or should you separate your identity and how you enter the space when you're writing for one of the children who were a child of color?
Well, I have to be aware of all of it. I mean, separating might imply ignoring or denying, and that isn't going to work as well. And I'm sure that it happens. I'm sure that it has happened. But those are all pieces. Those bits of my identity inform so much of what I've had access to in terms of education, or how people have talked to me and taught me how to be with kids. It's informed. I mean, just the social value system from where I grew up, where I've spent time. Those are all going to come into play when I'm writing about my kids and what I choose to focus on, or what I choose to leave out. And so hopefully I'm not the star of any story that I'm telling. But those bits are going to come into play. Just hopefully I'm able to acknowledge it and question it and be open when I get the feedback, like, oh, that isn't what I saw in that situation. Or, well, really, I think you should go this other way. These were the next steps you put out there. I really think actually you should go this other way with the next steps. So, the learning story isn't the be all end all. So yeah, it has to be very acknowledged and worked on, but just not the star of the story.
So you wrote 3 stories. Can you recall, if you can recall, what part of your identity did you have to be more mindful of as you wrote each one?
Well, starting off with the Ezra story, being a white and being and identifying as woman, that I just think about how that comes into play with my interactions with him, and the ways that I am expected to, the ways that I think I'm expected to control children, or at what point do I start seeing a kid's behavior as threatening or dangerous or risky. And so that in that story, I really had to be on it with that, and it brought up a lot of that for me. With the Margot story, I think she identifies as female, white. Same with the parent that mostly engaged with the story, and so it's interesting. I think that one, it probably wasn't as present, but it kind of it was basically allowed not to be, because having an artistic white girl is kind of a not a surprise to anybody. Like, it's the no one, Anyway, I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say with that. And then with the Liliana story, I think that one, again, as an English speaker and white, and that role as the female, the teacher in the classroom that has to have everything under control and keep a tight ship, or keep everything neat and tidy. She's so good at challenging that, and so that one, I think the power dynamics there being aware of those identity pieces in writing that story, and really trying to open up that power dynamic and shift it on purpose was important to me.
I'm glad you said Liliana because I was like, oh, what name did she use? Lucy?
I know. Well, and now I'm going through because it's gonna be easier if I just use their names, but I also want to respect family, privacy, and yeah. If you know, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Let's continue with Liliana. How was that process for you writing it in 2 languages? And I know you had Teresa support you is also on this call, and I might call her in to give some insight as well.
Yeah, she actually was the one that wrote it in 2 languages. Well, it was. I think in the past I would have done a copy and paste into Google Translate and then just gone on with my day. And I feel really grateful that Teresa was up for translating, and that there are other people in the building that I could go to for that as well. Because with a learning story, there is so much intention behind it that you want that message to get through, regardless of what language it's in. And so that part, I forget what the term is, but it's basically like translation with the original meaning in mind. So it might not be a direct word for word translation. It might be a different phrase, but the more important thing is that you're getting the actual meaning of it. Does that make sense?
I'm saying
maybe Teresa. Okay.
So yes.
Okay. I purposely don't have all of your faces on my screen because it's going to make me nervous.
And then I also want to see if Teresa has anything to add on top of that. Looks like it's a no. Yes.
I want to thank Chelsea for actually giving me the honor to do that. It was very exciting to. I speak it, but the writing part was practice. So thank you. And I think what you were talking about is like we really made sure that the content was exactly the way we wanted it to sound. So when Mom read it, it read the way that she wanted it to be intended. Because there was some stuff I was like, that is a little different if it were said in Mexico as opposed to Spain, right? And so it took us a little bit, but at the end of it, I think Mom was really really happy with the story, and I think that was kind of like a turning point, right? Like it was like, yes, you guys get my daughter. That's exactly her at home. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Which is a fascinating thought, Chelsea, because now I'm wondering about tone. How do you decide around the tone or what language you're actually going to use? Are you going to be more passive or aggressive? So can you just describe your writing style and how you decide between all of these complexities? Because as Teresa just said, it can change how it lands for families. And yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to get super corny. So the way I think about a learning story is, it's a version of a love letter. And there's been this expectation on assessment that it has to be objective, because obviously these are the things that kids need to know. And so your feelings about it don't matter, because this is just what came down from the sky, that this is what kids need to know, and it doesn't matter how you feel about it. And if that's how I was thinking about assessment, then yeah, my voice might be more passive, or it wouldn't be so, there wouldn't be as many exclamation points. But I don't know who told me this or where I got this idea. Maybe it was from Wendy Lee, one of a training or something like that. There's no need for objectivity in this learning story. That's you can't be objective. That's just not a thing. Objectivity isn't a thing. It's something we maybe like to believe about ourselves, but it's not really a thing. And so having that permission for myself to be subjective and to be personal, um, that makes all the difference. And what has that's why for me learning stories are such a big piece of connecting with families and connecting with the kids, and connecting with fellow educators, and then connecting with myself as an educator, is because it is this, in my mind, when I sit down to write a learning story, I'm like, I'm writing a love letter right now to this kid to tell them, to tell them all these things.
And I want to dig deeper into this self-reflection piece. So I saw your growth in terms of your writing over the years. Like your first story was, I think, 4 sentences. Your second story was 6, and so on and so forth. But how do you think you've grown your practice being with kids, being more intentional, being more responsive, leading with a anti-bias and then an anti-racism lens in your work?
How have I done that using learning stories?
How have the stories you wrote supported you as you go back and reflect on them?
I think on some occasions it's been this moment of, okay, what just happened feels important, but I don't totally know why. Oh, hold on just a second. My screen. So it'll be a situation of wanting to dig deeper on why that's grabbed my attention, and that will lead me to, oh, okay, this kid has really stepped out of the box, or something's happening here that challenges my assumptions. So that's this natural point of curiosity of why does this feel important. And some of it is I've declared for myself, this is the kind of educator I want to be. I want to be anti-racist. I want to be affirming for my kids. I want to be welcoming. And so I've set that bar for myself really high, which means I'm going to try to keep pushing to get there and ask for that feedback of, okay, I've joked, I need a shirt that's like, please tell me when I'm being racist. Like, please tell me when I've messed up. And so learning stories because you put that out, right? You put that out to the family or to teachers, and you can get that feedback of, well, I think you're kind of playing into the stereotype, or this language here actually wasn't very, wasn't really from a strengths-based approach. So it's that constant process of editing and reflecting and trying again, and like, okay, well, if I want to tell this story and share how important it is for Liliana to see herself, like why is that so important? I need to really go back to those resources, go back to that information of how she is going to be treated in the world, how the world sees her. Like, I see her a certain way, but the world is not going to honor those capabilities. And so that's why I'm going to choose to focus on that bit of her personality rather. Right now she's doing all this counting, so maybe I would focus on counting in the next one. But I'm going to focus on this intentionality and this engineering brain that she has, and not so much on these other things, because I want to elevate her. How's that for?
Yeah, no, that was great.
for a Friday at the end of the day.
So Liliana is graduating your class and going to a different one. What do you hope to communicate, or how do you expect to use these learning stories to communicate the brilliance of her to her next educator? And I specifically think and ask that because she's staying within our center. She's just going down the road. Um, but luckily for me, not to say she's my favorite, but because we're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, we
But
are favorites.
I think about when children leave our center and there's not that communication or opportunity to connect with a kindergarten teacher or first grade teacher. So how do you expect or try to craft your learning stories to communicate that, knowing that this might be the only chance you get to show her brilliance?
Well, I feel very lucky that, I know the educators that she's going to be with, they have a background with learning stories and will respect my perspective and respect that medium of learning stories, and also have spent time in the classroom with her. Knowing that I really don't always have access to their elementary school teachers, which I think should be a rule change that I do get access to them. But a piece that I hold very near and dear is basically validating to her family, validating to her that she's good, that her approach is good and it's legit and it should be treasured, and that I do have a lot of faith and trust in her family that they are going to advocate for her, but in case they need some backup, I am here in the background, and I can share this language and share this perspective, share this specific story to demonstrate that. So as she's going through the school system, or same with Ezra, that as they're going through these institutions, that they've heard these stories about themselves, the family has heard the story about them, and that can be a part of this foundation, basically, this foundation of advocating for themselves, or the family's advocating for the child.
I think, I'm not sure about Ezra, but Liliana was referred to speech development, I believe, when she holds so much language.
She doesn't stop talking.
I wonder how you can utilize learning stories to curb the overrepresentation of children of color in special ed classes, especially when they don't need it.
Absolutely. And again, I think it's that assumption that these assessments that would be used to place a child in therapy or a special ed class or something like that, that there's this assumption, this is an objective test. And I think learning stories can really challenge that notion. This test that's being used was not made with her in mind. It was not made with her in mind. And children in general don't always do well with those types of assessments, or like a sit down, let me quiz you about something you don't care about. And so I think learning stories have such a value in that they assess children in their natural habitat, and it's the natural state of being for them, and it can showcase all of those strengths there.
Have you, I probably should have thought of this question, thought it out before I started talking, but I'm wondering about how have you seen you reading the stories back to the child? has helped them find their agency, their voice, their identity. Can you just talk about that process and what changes you've seen, either from the three stories you shared, or just from any of them, really about building their positive inner voice?
Definitely. And I know a couple people already heard me tell this story today, but it's such a beautiful example, in my opinion. So this was a few years ago. There's a kiddo in my class, a girl, and she's very rough and tumble, very she does not need to back down from a fight. She is good. So she's right there. Hasn't always helped her out in certain social situations. And I'm being really careful with my language right now because I don't want to be setting this expectation that this girl in my class needs to love baby dolls and be gentle and that jazz. But I do want her to have friends and keep them. So I wrote a learning story about her. And it was, we were on the playground with it was when I was in the preschool room in River. And we were on the playground with the toddlers, the 2-year-olds. And my kids love to go around and around and around so fast with the trucks. And as we were coming on, and so I wrote this learning story about her with one of the toddlers giving this toddler a ride in the truck. And I was just so taken aback by how careful she was with this kid. She didn't dump her over. She didn't run too fast. And she kept checking in with the kid to make sure the kid was still having fun. And so I wrote a learning story about it and had shared it with her. And then we were coming out to the playground another time and the toddlers were out again. And I gave that messaging about that I see these littler ones. Let's make sure that we're careful and that we take good care of them. And she looked at me with her big brown eyes and she said, I do that. I can do that. I do that. And it just really knocked me over. And every time I tell this story, I get choked up like right here, because she saw herself this different way, or she saw herself maybe not in a different way, but in this more intentional way, that maybe that was something she didn't know about herself before. And I don't always get to have that kind of interaction with a kid after I've read their story, but you do see them go back to, I've seen Liliana go back to using all kinds of different materials to use with her paint. Everything's up for grabs. If it's in reach, it's up for grabs to be added into what she's doing, whether it's water or whatever. So that is a way that I see it happening.
We very much work in these communities of practices. So I wonder, how has writing learning stories and sharing them with your colleagues, how has learning stories supported the growth of your colleagues, especially if they are not their, like Liliana's lead teacher or primary educator?
Well, because we can let go of that objectivity and recognize that we are coming at this with our own priorities, I think one of the best ways that it helps each of us grow is hearing those other perspectives. And there's more than one way to be in the world. And there's so many valid ways to approach work with kids. And so sharing learning stories with each other, you get to know your coworkers a little better. Like, oh, that Chelsea, she's a real mushy one. She's always writing these sappy stories. She can turn anything into a sappy story. And then you just learn. Yeah, you get this wider perspective, therefore a more whole picture of this human, this child.
And what about how once again, either your writing has changed or your approaches with children has changed over the years through writing learning stories, specifically between the difference between working with um, 3 or 5 year olds and then 2 year olds.
Well, as I said earlier, learning stories definitely helped me slow down, and that taking away some of that sense of urgency um, has been really impactful for my teaching. That we have to stay exactly on this schedule, or that I really need them to understand this concept right now. I don't have to hold on to that urgency piece, which has really helpful with having moved now to toddlers, because there's plenty that's urgent that they will tell you about that I need to take care of right now, and so anything that I had on my plate really is irrelevant. Um, so that slowing down piece, the lack of urgency, and again disrupting that power dynamic. Um, I know I've heard it talked about in the past that hierarchy of adult child um, is I don't I'm not an expert in it at all, but I've heard it talked about in other frameworks of oppression. And so learning stories, even though I'm the one telling the story, I'm the one choosing what I'm telling the story about, I'm still going to write it about what I'm seeing is important to that kid, or what I see that kid focusing on. And it highlights, again, their natural way of being and exploring and learning. And so for me, it also keeps me a bit humble, and trying to keep that power dynamic in check, so that I'm much more that partner. I'm that friend that can be rooting for you, and not so much that bossy tall person that keeps making you clean up.
So before I turn it over to a couple of participants or audience members to ask their questions, feel free to write into the chat, or we can do the raise hands, or you can mute yourself, whatever feels more comfortable to you. I want to ask this question to buy some time. And my question is around have you ever written a learning story for a family, and then the family came back to you and they were like, no, I don't see my child like this. Like, whatever you just wrote was completely wrong.
No, I sometimes you don't get any response, which is a bit of a heartbreaker, and that will make me question, okay, did I miss something, or did I focus on something that they didn't care about or wasn't as important to them? Try not to take it personally, but try to also take it as a learning opportunity. Not everything's about me. So I haven't had that scenario. And also, for the most part, they're pretty positive stories. Even if I'm wrong, at least I'm wrong about something really nice. I don't know. But so I haven't had that feedback from a family that I was off base. More so, at times you just don't hear anything.
All right. So I want to make some space and invite the audience to share any thoughts or reflections or questions for Chelsea. Do we have any burning ones off the top of your heads? Anyone?
I know it's Friday at the end of the day, but I really
Yes,
they don't
Michelle.
even have to. Yeah.
Let's go with Michelle, and then we'll go with Pachi, and then Emily. I'm just seeing you as I see them. Yep, Michelle, you're talking, but I'm not hearing you. Are you connected to headphones or anything? Still not hearing you. How about type into the chat and then um, and then we will circle back to you. I'm going to shoot it back over to you, Pachi.
Yeah, not sure if it makes sense, this question, but bear with me. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more if in the process of writing about one child versus writing for a couple of a group of child, how does that look like, this process of pausing and reflecting about each individual in their story and their intersection of their identities and yours, and do you think you pause more, or is it a different kind of pause? If you can speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think photos are really helpful for me in those moments, especially for a group story, because I can go back and look at their facial expressions and get a closer look at each individual kid, as opposed to where I have this one kid in mind and I can be really focused on that in my memory. So it is a bit different, I think, in that I think I rely on pictures much more, or other artifacts. Yeah, and I haven't written as many group ones recently, so it's not as fresh on my brain. But I'm thinking about more of the in-depth writings, or even a weekly update kind of deal. That having that visual reminder is helpful.
And let's go over to Emily next.
I have a lot of questions, but I think
awesome.
I'm just a lot of questions, just thinking about the group and what I want people to hear from you. But I think I'll only ask one right now. But I do have one maybe for the end, Mike. But I'm wondering, like, what are the supports that you've used to help build out the stories that you're writing? Like, you're doing a lot of reflective thinking, and you are keeping your identities in mind. But what are some other things that you are utilizing or accessing that help you, besides planning time, right? Like, but that help you get to a place you feel satisfied in a story that you write?
Yeah. Well, I took my first thing was time. Having this really supportive community that wants to read your work and give feedback, especially when I was first starting at Hilltop, being able to, you were my mentor teacher at the time, and being able to share it with you and share it with my co-teachers, and have that back and forth with these other minds that are going to help with grammar and punctuation, but are also going to help, like, okay, this idea isn't very clear. Let's work it out a bit more, or this is way too much. You don't need all of that. Let's hone in on what really mattered. So for me, having that community piece is really helpful. And it's exciting knowing we're going towards this Educator platform that can be, have that format ready. I think for me, starting out and knowing that it could look a lot of ways, like that there's these certain components that need to be there, but it can be a Word document. It can be a PowerPoint. It could be put together in whatever. It could be handwritten. It could be whatever format works best, as long as you're getting the information out. That, letting go of some of that pressure that it has to look a certain way was important. And of course, access then to the technology to do that. Having the cameras ready, having the laptop, having those programs available. And we've also definitely, I had access to different trainings, workshops about writing learning stories and the value of learning stories. And finally, I think the expectation that it gets done. That you need to do 2 stories for each of your primaries, or however it's going to be set up. And that, for me, that's a good accountability piece. So that's support that is good for me. And Michelle, I know what she wanted to share basically was that that some families have taken their learning stories for their kids to their kindergarten teachers for conferences, and it's helped the school understand the kids' learning disposition and offer more support for the kids who are having a difficult transition. So that was what Michelle wanted to share.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from our participants before I go on with my questions, and then we'll circle back? Okay, don't see any hands. So great. What would Chelsea today say to Chelsea, not to age you, let's say 5 years ago, or back when you first started writing? What would she have said to you as a beginner writer, as a beginner educator?
Chill out. Don't be so hard on yourself. This is also what 5 years from now Chelsea is going to say to me currently. That your goals here are connection and building up your kids. Those are your goals, and it doesn't need to be fancy. You're not to relax a bit and let it be imperfect and just keep trying, and you'll figure out what works best for you. Yeah, probably give yourself some grace.
And what advice, or no, let's go to another one. I'm thinking about how we're moving into infants and how you will be an educator in that room. What strengths have you developed over the year that you will bring to this classroom? And do you imagine your writing will have to change or shift a bit in order to really hone in and highlight the brilliance of infants? Because most people, I think, just kind of think, oh yeah, they just exist.
Yeah. Well, I think me as an educator now has a better understanding of the validity of how children are learning as they are and as they exist. And even if it's a day of diapers and crying, and we don't get to do the color provocation that I had planned, or the sensory soft and rough provocation I had planned, that my kids were still developing, and that's just fine, and that's perfect. So again, that sense of urgency, I don't need to bring that into the classroom, except for emergencies, obviously. But I don't need to bring the urgency on my personal agenda into the classroom. So, and it's funny because I started with younger kids and went up, and now I'm kind of coming back down again. And each time it's just really nice to slow down and really appreciate the complexity and the simplicity. It can look so simple what's happening, but the complexity internally in their developing brains and bodies is just so dynamic. And so I'm really looking forward to expressing that to myself and to the families of just how much is really going on for these infants, and that we're focusing on these other, like, these relationship pieces and these the self concept pieces and the capability pieces for the infant. So I am anticipating that the stories will probably stay somewhat similar. I feel like I've gotten pretty good at I like the length of the stories that I write these days. I feel like they're pretty digestible. I used to be a much longer writer. So in respect for that simplicity, my stories can also follow suit. And so I think, it's still probably, even if I'm not reading it to my kids, which kind of maybe depends on what I'm doing, I think I still will probably write it to them to honor that perspective and honor those capabilities. But now in the middle of my question, now I'm thinking about, well, what is the format of the books that I am going to be reading to kids, or what kind of print is going to be in the room? So can my learning stories be mimic that? So yeah, now you got me. I've got other thoughts that aren't fully developed, and I really would love to learn from people who have been in infant rooms and writing learning stories.
Gotcha. I'll put that on my list of things to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
My next question is, how have you used learning stories in team meetings, with mentor teachers on your one-on-one, with conversations with your program supervisor, and how have you used them to set future provocations?
Oh, definitely. A lot of discussion at times it makes sense to bring things in when they're not as formed. So, okay, I have these photos and I have these observations, I have these quotes. I'm not quite sure what I have yet. And so as a team, we can talk about it, and maybe we decide, okay, well, I think this is the beginning of something, but it makes me want to do this other thing. So maybe I'll start on this story, but we're going to offer up this. So, for example, we had a couple kids that were always arguing. They were always fighting. They were fighting over maybe everything. And eventually we decided, well, let's film it. Let's film it and show it back to them. And that wasn't necessarily a learning story situation, but it was a moment where it's like, okay, we have these bits in place, and it makes it, now we want to see what happens if we do this other thing. So that's one way that it comes up in team meetings. Mentors, and I'll just speak directly about working with Emily, because she was really the mentor teacher that I've worked with as I've been writing learning stories. And for me, it was always really helpful to have that perspective from her, just all the experience she'd had with kids in the classroom and what she observed of the kids in my classroom. So that for me was always a really mind expanding opportunity. Like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And trying to think of times I think really one of the only times I've interacted with a program supervisor was Teresa with the translation bit. I might have gotten feedback of that's a great story or whatever, but not so much on that level. I think it's more of a springboard to share perspectives.
Great. I'm going to ask another question and then have some time for participants to ask theirs. But I guess here is, what advice do you have for first time educators or writers who are approaching this for the first time in this daunting task that they have to write this piece that will carry on forever?
Write this beautiful novel that will be the one defining story for this child for the rest of their life. But it's not that. I would say to get really clear with yourself about your values as an educator and your values around assessment. And I gave my values in sharing learning stories about connection and building up the self-concept for my kids, but you gotta to know why it's important to you. And if right now it's just because they're telling me to, then that's legit. And you're gonna kind of work on it and find a rhythm, and then start getting that feedback back and forth, and that can help you define, like, oh, okay, that felt really good to have that exchange with the family, and now we have this better relationship, and okay, maybe so the next time I write a learning story for this family, I really want to highlight that piece or hone in on that. So yeah, getting really clear about why it matters.
And now I want to open it up to anyone who has additional thoughts, questions. What's on the top of people's minds?
I have one, but I don't want to take up all the space, so I'm trying to make someone else go.
I know the struggle. I'm not good at it. Well, why don't you ask it? And then we'll give more time for building up nerves.
Okay. My question is similar to a couple that Mike has already asked, but maybe a little bit different. I guess I'm wondering, like, and you might not even be able to tap into it, but you've been writing stories for a while. You didn't start with this level of comfortability with it. And I'm wondering, for people like Mike saying who are just getting into it, like if there's a way you could describe sort of what your cycle of learning stories has been, like how were you feeling when you started, and what were you thinking, what were your challenges, and what did that cycle look like? How did you get to a place of learning stories? Is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yeah. I think at first I really struggled with that idea of subjectivity versus objectivity. And worrying that, well, this isn't a formal standardized assessment. People aren't going to take it seriously, or it's not going to be seen as valid because it's not this state sanctioned or mandated form that I'm filling out, and so that's definitely where I started. We're like, okay, I mean, maybe learning stories are going to be a nice add-on, but how do I legitimize this format? And really, as I'm talking to, I'm thinking about, how it was my own insecurity as well of, how I'm not an expert. How am I an expert? I don't have a doctorate in this. I have to use these tools that experts came up with to know how my kids are doing. So I mean, even early on, as I started at Hilltop, I remember trying to figure out what is the best way to include like the state standards or different developmental guidelines into the story so that families will know that this is legit, that, you know, families will respect what I'm offering. And I think that's probably something I still struggle with a bit, just depending on the family. You don't always get that reception, or it's like, oh, that's a nice story. But I feel much more confident that I know what I'm doing, and that I know my kids, and I have that grasp of development, and how these things manifest into their play or into their language, into their relationships. And so I'm better equipped on sharing that out. So it's probably more of a journey of my own confidence as an educator and seeing myself as capable. Yeah.
Any additional thoughts from people in the audience? Django, unless you're just doing hand movements.
So this is my my version of ASL for I have something to say. You know, just reflecting on learning stories and Chelsea's journey too, imagining kind of where she started talking about her first learning story was just like a couple sentences, but it just kind of propelled me forward into the advocacy realm about how we not only want our parents to see the value in learning stories, not just within this time that they're at Hilltop, but that a child and a human being's educational journey is a story. You know, all those anecdotes we share from school. Oh, my favorite teacher did this one thing this one time, and then when I was in high school, I had this other favorite teacher that did this one thing this one time. You know, all the stories about our educational journey, we typically make them as entertaining as possible because we enjoy those things. We brought meaning into our lives and into lives of the people with us. And I'm always trying to think of ways to really engage people in this kind of conversation, to advocate for learning stories beyond what we're doing. So it doesn't seem like this cutesy little thing that the preschool teachers do, and now we're in elementary school, and now the real learning is going to happen.
Right.
And just, just get so, you know, I don't know. That's my thoughts.
I have 2 questions left, and I know we're up against time. The first one is, have you ever ran into a child years later and they were like, hey, thank you for really, truly seeing me in the story?
Not yet, but maybe Michelle can arrange that with Hazel May. Not necessarily verbatim like that, but it just sets you up to have a better relationship with that child overall. You know, and sorry, Michelle, I'm just going to keep using Hazel May as an example. When I was Hazel's teacher, you know, we spent a lot of time like that, but now I get invited to her birthday parties, and I'll never forget, I think one of the first ones I went to, she just ran up to me and gave me the biggest hug. I'm like, what's happening? This is amazing. And so because I can come to it in a really authentic way, she knows that I care, even if I'm not giving her, you know, if I'm not doing what she wants me to do, which was not often. She even asked her mom to ask me what was she like in the river room that was difficult, or like how was she difficult in river room, and that question just blew me away, and really was grateful for that trust that she would put out there. Like, hey, I'm just looking for feedback on on that. So it's more, I think that learning stories support that authenticity as an educator and that voice you have. And so then in your interactions with the kids, it's just much more genuine.
So my last question before I have one other thing to say is, how has this built your own positive voice, to your own positive voice as an educator?
That's a good question. And like I referenced from Emily's question, realizing how much of my own self-concept and self-esteem or confidence, whatever, all those bits, how much that plays into my willingness and openness to approach assessment from this way. And I do pretty well with external reinforcement. I'm not. I like to have. I would give my learning stories to my co-educators. Like, okay, what do you think? Please, I think I would just straight up ask, what did I do wrong, or what did I get wrong in this? And they, and I'm thinking specifically of when I was working with Jacob and Michelle, and they'd be like, you're fine. Like we don't have time to read every single one of your stories, Chelsea. You're great. It's just send it. You can leave us after it. So basically taking some of those steps to own it more, like, oh, okay, instead of I'm going to write this story and then get the feedback and then, cut and paste Emily's email into my learning story, or, just verbatim take some language, I'm going to write this story and own it and send it to the family and read it to the kid, and to take that jump and I mean, it's another kind of positive, external reinforcement, but to get that feedback from the family and from the kid that, thank you for that. Seeing that kiddo with her big brown eyes telling me, I do that. I'm safe. I'm kind. That helps me have a more positive inner voice, but always something to work on.
Thank you. So I just have one last ask before I let everyone go, and this requires everyone to kind of just unmute themselves. And I'm hoping you can follow my lead on this one. All right. So now that everyone is unmuted, and thank goodness Jill just left because she would have embarrassed us all. But I feel like you'll catch my drift as I start doing this. Happy
birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Michelle. Happy Thank you very much, everyone.
Michelle.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Michelle. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, go enjoy your weekend.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you,